December 16th, 1944, 5:30 a.m. A German 88mm shell screams through frozen Belgian air and detonates directly inside an American command post. The explosion kills 4 men instantly. A 5th is thrown 20 feet into the snow, his ears bleeding, his uniform on fire. He is 22 years old. His name is Private First Class Raymond Kowalski. 3 weeks ago, he was stocking shelves at a grocery store in Cleveland, Ohio. He is not a warrior. He is not a soldier by nature. He is a kid who bagged groceries and argued with his mother about doing the dishes. And yet, within 6 hours of that explosion, the most powerful armored offensive the Third Reich had ever launched on the Western Front would begin to die. Not because of a brilliant general's counterstroke, not because of some secret superweapon, but because of a system. A terrifying, unstoppable, almost inhuman system that the Germans had spent 3 years completely failing to understand. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next videos. Join us as we explore more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Be part of our community and share these incredible journeys with others. By the time the Battle of the Bulge ended on January 25, 1945, Germany had lost 100,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Over 700 tanks and assault guns destroyed or abandoned. And the man who had designed this last desperate gamble, Adolf Hitler himself, would later say in private that the real reason it failed was not American bravery. It was American abundance. But to understand what truly broke the German military mind when it collided with the United States Army, we have to go back further, back to a time when the Germans were absolutely certain they would win. The year is 1939, and the Wehrmacht is the most feared military machine the world has ever seen. Think about what that means for a moment. These are not amateurs. These are professionals who have spent 20 years studying every defeat of the First World War with surgical precision, tearing apart every failure, rebuilding from the bones up. Their doctrine of Auftragstaktik, mission-based command, is revolutionary. A German sergeant in the field is trusted to make battlefield decisions that in any other army would require a colonel. Speed, aggression, initiative. Strike before the enemy can react. Exploit every gap. Never stop moving. It works in Poland. It works in France. It works so catastrophically well in France that an entire British army has to swim home from Dunkirk to survive. By 1941, German officers genuinely believe they have perfected the art of war. Not improved it. Perfected it. And then they look west across the Atlantic Ocean, and they see America. And they are not afraid. They are amused. Their intelligence assessments from this period make for remarkable reading today. One 1942 German military study describes the United States as a nation of merchants and entertainers fundamentally unsuited to the demands of modern warfare. Another report notes that the American soldier lacks the ideological conviction necessary for serious combat. A Wehrmacht training manual circulated to officers on the Western Front warns them not to underestimate American equipment, but specifically states that American infantry can be broken by aggressive counterattack because they lack fighting spirit. This was not propaganda written for German newspapers. This was what the German High Command actually believed. They had fought the British methodical and stubborn. They had fought the Soviets savage and inexhaustible. They thought they understood war in all its forms. America was just another country that would have to learn the hard way. They had no idea what was coming. The man standing at the center of this story did not look like a soldier who would change the course of history. His name was Sergeant First Class William Bill Dawson, and before the war he had spent 7 years as a line foreman at a Ford assembly plant in Dearborn, Michigan. He managed a crew of 41 men building engines. He tracked output numbers. He solved production bottlenecks. He yelled at men who slowed down the line. He had never fired a rifle in anger before 1943. Dawson was 34 years old when he shipped out to England, older than most of the men in his platoon, with thick forearms from years of factory work, and a flat, patient Midwestern voice that never seemed to rise above a certain calm frequency, no matter what was happening around him. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel James Hargrave, would later write in his memoir that Dawson was the most unimpressive soldier he had ever seen at inspection, and the most effective he had ever seen in the field. The reason was simple and devastating. Dawson did not think like a soldier. He thought like a factory foreman, and that made him terrifying. When Dawson's unit, part of the 29th Infantry Division, came ashore at Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, the chaos that met them was absolute. Men were dying in the surf. Officers were cut down before they reached dry sand. The plan, the beautiful, precisely coordinated plan developed over months by brilliant men in safe rooms, disintegrated within 90 seconds of the first landing craft dropping its ramp. Other men froze. Other men ran. Other men waited for orders that would never come because the men who were supposed to give those orders were already dead. Dawson looked at the beach the way he used to look at a jammed assembly line. He identified the problem. He identified the resources available. He got the line moving again. He grabbed 7 men he had never worked with before, pointed at a gap in the German defenses on the bluff above them, and said 4 words: "We're going up there." Not a speech, not a rallying cry, just a direction and an assumption that the men behind him were going to follow, because that is how you talk to men on a factory floor who need to move. They followed him. And the gap they exploited that morning was later identified as one of the critical breach points that began to unravel the German defense of Omaha Beach. But here is where the story gets strange. Here is where Bill Dawson's particular genius becomes visible. After the beach, as Dawson's unit pushed inland into the nightmare green tangle of the Norman Bocage, the hedgerow country, he started noticing something that was driving every other American officer to the edge of madness. The hedgerows were killing them. These ancient earthen walls, some of them 5 feet thick and hundreds of years old, turned every field into a fortress. German machine gun teams would set up perfect ambushes behind them. American platoons would advance down a lane and get cut to pieces before they could even see the enemy. The standard response was to call in artillery, effective but slow, very slow. Sometimes 30 minutes to an hour to coordinate a barrage. In 30 minutes, a lot of men could die. Dawson watched this happening day after day in the sweltering July heat of Normandy. He watched the process the way he used to watch a bottleneck on his assembly line, tapping his finger against his canteen, calculating. The problem was not firepower. They had plenty of firepower. The problem was the time between identifying a target and destroying it. That gap, that 30-minute gap, was where American soldiers were dying. Every experienced officer he raised this with gave him the same answer. That is how artillery coordination works. That is the system. You cannot compress the timeline without creating dangerous confusion. The idea of dramatically accelerating fire coordination was considered by the professional military men around him to be somewhere between naive and suicidal. One captain told Dawson directly, "You want to speed up artillery, you'll end up dropping shells on your own men. We've seen it happen." The answer is no. Dawson went back to his foxhole and started writing on a piece of paper. What he sketched out that night in a muddy Norman field was not a tactical innovation. It was a production optimization. He was not rethinking how to call in artillery. He was rethinking the workflow of calling in artillery, stripping out every redundant step the way you strip unnecessary movement from an assembly line, creating a standardized, simplified communication protocol that any radio operator could execute in under 8 minutes instead of 30. He called it, with characteristic factory floor unromanticism, the quickfire request. His commanding officer looked at it, looked at Dawson and said, "This is either brilliant or the stupidest thing I've seen this month. We're not trying it." Dawson tried it anyway. On July 18, 1944, during a push near the village of St. Lo, his platoon came under fire from a concealed German MG-42 position behind a hedgerow to their northeast. Men went down. The standard process would have taken 25 to 30 minutes to bring artillery onto that position. Dawson got on the radio himself. He used his system. He spoke in the clipped, pre-formatted language he had designed specifically to eliminate any back-and-forth confirmation steps. He gave his coordinates. He gave the target coordinates. He gave one code word that pre-authorized the fire mission under his protocol. First, shells landed in 9 minutes and 40 seconds. The German machine gun team ceased to exist 11 minutes after opening fire. Dawson's platoon took 2 wounded that afternoon, instead of what would likely have been 8 to 12 dead. When Lieutenant Colonel Hargrave reviewed the after-action report that evening, he sat in silence for a long moment, then picked up a pen and formally approved the quick-fire request as standard procedure for his battalion. Within 3 weeks, 2 adjacent battalions had adopted variations of it. Within 6 weeks, it had traveled up the chain of command to divisional level with a recommendation for wider study. A factory foreman from Michigan had looked at a military process and treated it exactly like a jammed production line, and the result was that American infantry could now bring coordinated artillery fire down on a German position in a fraction of the time the Germans believed was physically possible. When German units began encountering this new speed, the confusion in their own after-action reports is almost palpable. One Fallschirmjäger officer wrote in July 1944, "The American artillery response time has become incomprehensible. We are engaging targets and receiving counter-battery fire before our own retreat is completed. This is not possible under normal fire coordination procedures. Either the Americans have a new system, or their artillery is positioned far further forward than we have assessed." He was right on both counts. And he had no idea that the man behind the new system had spent the previous decade arguing with autoworkers about engine output ratios. But here is what the Germans didn't understand, and what makes this story so much larger than one sergeant and one innovation. Dawson's quick-fire request was not an accident. It was not a random piece of genius appearing from nowhere. It was a symptom of something deeply structurally different about the American military system. The Wehrmacht selected officers from a narrow, carefully cultivated pool. Prussian military families, academy graduates, men bred and trained from boyhood for command. This produced extraordinary tactical officers, but it also produced a system that could not easily absorb external thinking. You could not parachute a factory foreman into a German battalion and expect his ideas about workflow optimization to be welcomed by men who had spent 15 years studying Clausewitz. The American Army took anyone. It took teachers and truck drivers, lawyers and line cooks, farmers and factory foremen. And then, critically, it created structures that allowed the best ideas from those people to travel upward through the system with remarkable speed, because the American officer corps had been taught not to see that as a threat to authority, but as an asset to be exploited. Dawson's idea moved from a muddy foxhole to divisional recommendation in 6 weeks. That is extraordinary. In any other army of that era, a sergeant's unsanctioned modification to artillery protocols would have resulted in a court-martial, not a commendation. This is what was beginning to terrify the German officers who were paying close attention. It was not that America had better soldiers in the individual sense. Many German soldiers were tactically superior, man for man. It was that America had built a military that learned faster, adapted faster, and fed innovation upward through its ranks faster than anything the traditional European military mind had conceived of. They had built an army on the same principles that had built their factories. Efficiency, scalability, the constant restless optimization of every process, the willingness to let a man on the floor tell management that the line could run better. And as the summer of 1944 turned to autumn and the American armies drove east toward Germany with a momentum that seemed almost mechanical in its relentlessness, the senior German commanders were beginning to run out of explanations that fit their existing worldview. The Americans were supposed to be amateurs. Amateurs do not adapt this quickly. Amateurs do not build systems this resilient. Amateurs do not send wave after wave of replacement men and equipment with the calm, steady rhythm of a production line running on schedule. Field Marshal Walter Model, one of Germany's most capable defensive commanders, wrote to OKW in October 1944 with a question that must have seemed almost philosophical coming from a man of his background. At what point, he wrote, does material superiority become indistinguishable from strategic genius? He never received a satisfactory answer, because the answer was uncomfortable. The answer was that America had not separated those two things. They had fused them. The strategy was the material. The production was the plan. And somewhere in a Belgian forest, as December turned deadly cold, and Hitler prepared his final gamble in the Ardennes, a system built by factory foremen and line workers and grocery store stockers was about to face the ultimate test. But in Part 2, we will see something that even the architects of that system had not fully anticipated. Because the Battle of the Bulge would reveal not just the strength of the American way of war, it would reveal something darker. Something the Germans had noticed in their interrogation reports and whispered about in their prison camps. A quality in the American soldier that had no equivalent in their doctrine, no category in their training manuals. The question that would haunt every German commander who survived the winter of 1944 was this: how do you defeat an army that simply refuses to believe it can lose? In Part 1, we met Sergeant First Class Bill Dawson, a Ford factory foreman from Michigan, who looked at the bloody chaos of the Norman hedgerows and saw what every professional military officer had missed. He saw a production bottleneck. His quick-fire request system compressed artillery response time from 30 minutes to under 10, and within 6 weeks, it had traveled from a muddy foxhole to divisional recommendation. Men who should have died came home. The German after-action reports were already filling with a new, uncomfortable word: incomprehensible. But compressing the timeline inside one battalion was one thing. The real battle was not in the hedgerows. It was in a conference room 40 miles behind the front lines, where men with stars on their shoulders and 30 years of institutional habit were about to tell Bill Dawson exactly what they thought of factory foremen who rewrote military doctrine without permission. And here is the number that puts everything in context. In the summer of 1944, American artillery units on the Western Front were firing an average of 27,000 shells per day. With standard coordination protocols, approximately 34% of those fire missions arrived too late to affect the tactical situation that triggered them. That is roughly 9,000 shells per day, landing on positions that had already moved, already shifted, already killed their intended targets, and disappeared back into the hedgerows. 9,000 shells, every single day, wasted. Dawson knew this number, and it was about to get him into serious trouble. The meeting happened on August 3, 1944, in a requisitioned farmhouse outside Caen. Colonel Richard Abernathy, G3. Operations for the division sat behind a folding table with 2 other staff officers, and looked at Dawson the way a man looks at something he has stepped in. Abernathy was 51 years old, a West Point graduate, a veteran of the First World War, and a man who had spent 3 decades learning that military systems exist for reasons that junior sergeants are not equipped to understand. "Sergeant," Abernathy said without looking up from the papers in front of him, "are you aware that your unauthorized protocol modification constitutes a violation of Field Artillery Manual FM 6-40 sections 12 through 17? "Yes, sir," Dawson said. "And yet you proceeded anyway." "The men were dying, sir. The protocol was killing them." Abernathy looked up then. "The protocol exists to prevent friendly fire incidents. It exists because a corporal with a radio and too much enthusiasm has killed more American soldiers than some German units I could name. You want to strip out the confirmation steps. You want to trust a system with no verification redundancy. And you are standing here telling me the answer to our casualties is to move faster and check less." Dawson was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sir, in my battalion last month we had 11 men killed in engagements where artillery was requested, but arrived after the engagement was over. 0 men killed by friendly fire using my protocol. I'd like to show you those numbers." Abernathy closed the folder. "What I'd like, Sergeant, is for you to return to your unit and allow the people responsible for fire coordination doctrine to handle fire coordination doctrine. If I receive one more report of unsanctioned protocol modifications, I will have you reassigned to a supply depot in England. Do I make myself clear?" Dawson said yes, sir, saluted, and walked out of the farmhouse into the August heat. He stood in the road for a long moment watching a column of Sherman tanks rumble past toward the front, and he did the calculation he always did when a line was jammed, and management had just told him to leave it alone. He counted what it was going to cost. He decided he did not accept the cost. He needed an ally. and he found one in the most unlikely office in the entire theater of operations. Major General Harold Goss was not a combat commander. He was the senior logistics and efficiency officer for the 1st United States Army, a man whose job was to count things, measure things, and find ways to make the enormous machine of a modern army run with less friction. He had spent the previous 2 years in England working on supply chain optimization, and before that, he had spent 20 years in civilian industry. He was in the deepest sense a man who thought in the same language as Bill Dawson, a mutual acquaintance. A signals captain named Torres, who had watched Dawson's system work in real time outside St. Lo, made the introduction. Goss read Dawson's numbers in 11 minutes, set the paper down, and asked one question. Has anyone run a formal efficiency analysis on current fire coordination loss rates across the full Army? Nobody had. Because in the military mind, fire coordination was a safety system, not a production process. You did not optimize safety systems. You followed them. Goss looked at Dawson. "Give me 3 days," he said. What Goss produced in those 3 days was a document that landed on the desk of 3 brigadier generals simultaneously. It demonstrated, using data pulled from after-action reports across 4 divisions, that delayed fire coordination was directly contributing to an estimated 340 additional American casualties per month on the Western Front. It also demonstrated that Dawson's protocol in the limited engagements where it had been applied showed 0 incidents of friendly fire and an average effectiveness improvement of 67%. It concluded with a single line that Goss had learned in 2 decades of corporate America always gets the attention of men who control budgets and bear responsibility for outcomes. The current system is not safe. It is expensive. Colonel Abernathy received a phone call the following morning. The formal test was approved. 1 chance. Controlled conditions. A panel of observers, including 2 artillery colonels and a representative from Army Ground Forces Headquarters. If it worked under test conditions, they would consider a wider evaluation. If it failed, or if there was a single friendly fire incident, the protocol died permanently, and Dawson faced formal disciplinary review. He had 12 days to prepare. The test site was a stretch of farmland north of Mortain, cleared of civilians and marked with observation posts at measured intervals. The date was August 19, 1944. The morning was overcast, temperature around 62 degrees with a light wind from the northwest that would affect nothing but felt relevant somehow. There were 14 men in the observation group, and 11 of them arrived with the body language of people attending a formality they had already decided the outcome of. The scenario was straightforward. A simulated German MG position would be designated at a randomly selected grid coordinate within a defined area. Dawson's team, using his quick-fire request protocol, would attempt to achieve fire for effect shells actually landing on target within 12 minutes of the simulated enemy contact report. The standard protocol benchmark for this same scenario, timed across 3 previous test runs, was 26 minutes. Standard protocol ran first. A trained fire direction team using the approved FM6-40 procedure worked through the confirmation sequence. Back-channel verification. Read-back requirements. Secondary authorization. The shells landed at 23 minutes and 40 seconds. One of the artillery colonels noted this approvingly in his notebook. Then Dawson's team set up. The radio operator was a 20-year-old from Alabama named Corporal James Whitfield, who had spent 2 weeks learning the quick-fire request format until he could recite every element in sequence from a dead stop. He sat down, adjusted his headset, and looked at Dawson. Dawson looked at his watch, nodded. Contact report came in. Whitfield began transmitting immediately. The pre-formatted sequence eliminated every confirmation step that did not directly affect shell placement, replacing them with a single coded authorization string that Dawson had designed to carry the verification information embedded in its structure, rather than as a separate back-and-forth exchange. It was exactly what he had done on the factory floor when he redesigned the engine sign-off process in 1937, collapsing a 6-step checklist into a 2-step verification without losing any of the safety data. The first ranging rounds hit at 7 minutes and 12 seconds. Fire for effect was called at 8 minutes and 51 seconds. The observation group was silent. One of the artillery colonels walked forward to the impact markers, looked at the pattern, walked back and said nothing for almost 30 seconds. The shells had landed within an 18-meter circle centered on the designated target, tighter than the standard protocol result, faster by 15 minutes and 9 seconds. The General Forces representative, a lieutenant colonel named Park, who had said nothing since arriving, opened his notebook and wrote one sentence. He did not share what it said. He did not need to. His expression had already shifted from polite skepticism to something that looked like arithmetic, the face of a man adding up implications. They ran it again with a different grid coordinate. 8 minutes and 33 seconds to fire for effect. And again. 9 minutes and 4 seconds. Average time across 3 runs. 8 minutes, 49 seconds. Against a standard protocol, average of 26 minutes. Reduction, 66%. No friendly fire incidents. Shell dispersion equal to or better than standard protocol on all 3 runs. The formal approval came through on September 2, 1944. The quickfire request was designated for evaluation across 3 additional divisions with a training rollout to begin within 30 days. It was by any military bureaucratic standard a remarkable speed of adoption. Goss had pushed hard. Park's report had used language that made the casualty cost of non-adoption impossible to ignore. But the front does not wait for training rollouts. Dawson spent the next 6 weeks bouncing between battalion command posts in a jeep with mud on everything, standing in front of groups of radio operators and fire direction teams who had been told they were going to change the way they did their jobs and had immediately decided they were not. He had the same argument in 11 different locations. The argument always started the same way. This removes the verification step. That step exists for a reason. The verification information is embedded in the authorization string. The step is still there. It just takes 3 seconds instead of 4 minutes. Who designed this? I did. What's your background? And here Dawson would pause because this was always the moment. Ford Motor Company, assembly line management. Silence. Then almost always some version of, "You're telling me an auto worker redesigned military fire coordination. I'm telling you men are dying in the gap." Yes. By October 15, 1944, units operating with the quickfire request system were reporting average response times of 9 minutes, 3 seconds across real combat engagements. Units still using standard protocol were averaging 24 minutes. The casualty differential between the 2 groups, tracked quietly by Goss's office, was significant enough that by November, the evaluation period was quietly ended and the protocol was forwarded for Army-wide consideration. The Germans noticed. They could not explain what they were noticing, which was worse. Their after-action reports from October and November 1944 contain repeated references to American artillery responsiveness that defied their tactical assumptions. One German regimental commander wrote, "It is no longer safe to hold a fire position for more than 6 minutes after first engagement. The Americans are adapting faster than doctrine permits." He was right, and he was about to discover that artillery was only the beginning. Because in December 1944, in a frozen Belgian forest, the German army was going to throw everything it had left at the American system. One final massive, perfectly planned offensive designed by the best military minds in Europe. And what stopped it was not a better general or a smarter strategy. It was the fact that Bill Dawson was not the only factory foreman who had gone to war. In Part 3, we will see what happens when the German Ardennes offensive, the most dangerous moment the American army faced in the entire Western campaign, collides with a system that had been quietly, relentlessly optimizing itself for 18 months. And we will meet the men who made a decision that military historians still debate today. A decision that looked from the outside like madness. From the inside, it was the most American thing imaginable. The question is whether you can hold a surrounded town with no resupply, no air cover, and a general who refuses to retreat when the entire German 7th Army is coming through the trees. In Part 1, a Ford factory foreman named Bill Dawson looked at the bloody stalemate of the Norman hedgerows and saw a production bottleneck. He built a system that cut artillery response time from 30 minutes to under 9. In Part 2, that system survived a hostile military bureaucracy, passed a formal test under the eyes of skeptical colonels, and began spreading across the Western Front. By November 1944, units using the quick-fire request were averaging 9 minutes to fire for effect. Units without it were still at 24. The Germans had noticed something was wrong. They just did not know what. And now, in December 1944, they were about to find out. Because the Wehrmacht had been collecting data too. Their intelligence officers had spent 3 months analyzing the pattern of American artillery response in Normandy, Brittany, and the Siegfried Line approaches. What they found disturbed them enough to convene a special analysis session at Army Group B headquarters in mid-November. The conclusion of that session was documented and later captured by Allied forces. It read, "American fire coordination capability has improved by an estimated factor of 3 since July 1944. Current response windows no longer permit standard hold and relocate tactics. Units are sustaining casualties from counter-battery fire before displacement is complete. Cause unknown. Cause unknown." 3 words that represented the complete failure of German military intelligence to comprehend that the improvement had not come from new technology or new doctrine issued from above. It had come from a factory foreman with a piece of paper and a radio operator from Alabama. By early December, German artillery and mortar crews along the Western Front had been issued emergency guidance. Do not hold a firing position for more than 5 minutes after first round. Relocate immediately. Increase camouflage. Disperse. The guidance acknowledged in careful bureaucratic language that American counter-battery response had become dangerously fast and that the tactical window for safe displacement had collapsed. This adaptation cost the Germans something significant. Rapid relocation after firing means reduced accuracy on subsequent rounds. Increased dispersion means reduced mutual support between positions. Units following the new guidance were less effective at coordinated fire support, which degraded their infantry's ability to hold defensive positions under American assault. The tactical ripple from one sergeant's protocol redesign was now visible at regimental level across multiple German formations. German casualties from counter-battery fire in November 1944 were 34% higher than the July average. Forward artillery observer teams, the men who called in German fire missions, began refusing to stay in exposed positions for more than 4 minutes. This caution saved some lives, but blinded German commanders to real-time battlefield developments because observers who relocate constantly observe less. But this was not the only problem the quick-fire request had created. Because when you solve one problem at scale, you often discover 3 problems you did not know existed. The crisis arrived on December 4, 1944, 12 days before the Ardennes offensive began. A fire mission called in using the quick-fire request protocol by a unit of the 4th Infantry Division resulted in shells landing 200 meters short of the designated target. 3 American soldiers were wounded. None killed, but the incident was enough. Colonel Abernathy, who had never stopped watching for exactly this moment, filed a formal incident report the same afternoon. He was not wrong to do so. A protocol that eliminates verification steps carries inherent risk, and the incident was real evidence that the risk was not theoretical. His report went to the same brigadier generals who had approved the evaluation, and it landed on their desks with the weight of validation. Dawson was called in on December 6th. The meeting was shorter than the first one, which was not a good sign. "Your system caused a friendly fire incident," the brigadier said. "My system was misapplied," Dawson said. "The operator skipped the coordinate readback, which is not part of my protocol reduction. That step was never removed. The investigation is ongoing. Sir, with respect, the investigation will confirm what I'm telling you. But in the meantime, units are being told to suspend use of the protocol. That decision is going to cost lives." The brigadier looked at him for a long moment. "Dismissed, Sergeant." For 6 days, the quick-fire request was suspended across all units pending investigation review. 6 days during which American artillery response times climbed back toward 24 minutes. 6 days during which German units, noticing the change, began holding their positions longer and firing with greater confidence. Dawson spent those 6 days writing the most detailed technical document of his life. He mapped every step of the protocol. He identified exactly which step the operator had skipped and demonstrated with data from 47 previous missions that the step had never been removed from his system. He cross-referenced the incident against the operator's training record and found he had received only 1 day of instruction instead of the required 3. The protocol had not failed. The training pipeline had failed. Goss read the document in one sitting and took it directly to the investigation panel. The reinstatement came on December 12, 1944, 4 days before the German offensive began. Dawson did not know it at the time, but the timing was going to matter more than anything else in the entire story. December 16, 1944, 5:30 in the morning. The Ardennes. 2,000 German artillery pieces open fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front. The noise is described by survivors as physical a pressure wave that arrives before the sound a wall of force that knocks men off their feet inside reinforced bunkers. The offensive, Hitler has named Watch on the Rhine, crashes into the American lines in the darkness, and the snow and the fog that grounds every Allied aircraft and blinds every observer. By 8 a.m. 3, German armies are driving west through gaps in the American line. The 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived in theater and positioned in what was considered a quiet sector, is struck by the full weight of the German 6th Panzer Army. 2 regiments are cut off. The breakthrough is real. The maps at 1st Army headquarters are being redrawn by the hour. But here is what the German planners had not fully accounted for. The American units that hold the ones that anchor the flanks and slow the penetration in the critical first 48 hours are disproportionately concentrated in formations where the quick-fire request has been in use the longest. The 2nd Infantry Division, which has been operating with the protocol since September, is positioned on the northern shoulder of the Bulge near the twin villages of Krinkelt and Rocherath. What happens there on December 17th and 18th is one of the least celebrated and most consequential defensive actions of the entire Western campaign. 2 SS Panzer divisions, the 12th and elements of the first drive toward Krinkelt-Rocherath with the objective of opening the northern route to the Meuse. The villages are the key. Lose them, and the entire northern shoulder collapses. The German planners have allocated 48 hours to take them. They believe the American units there are under strength, disorganized, and suppressed by the weight of the initial bombardment. They are wrong on every count. Dawson is not in Krinkelt-Rocherath. He is 30 miles south, attached to a battalion near Wiltz. But his system is there. The radio operators know it. The fire direction teams have been running it for 3 months. The 1st German armor enters the outskirts of Rocherath at 0640 on December 17th. Mark IV tanks, followed by armored infantry. The American infantry companies fall back to prepared positions inside the village, fighting from house to house. It is brutal, close grinding work. Men die in doorways. Tank guns fire through walls. The temperature is 12 degrees Fahrenheit, and the snow turns gray with debris. At 0712, a company commander radios a fire mission. His position, a church on the northern edge of Rocherath. Target a column of German armor on the road 300 meters north, dismounting infantry. He is under direct fire. His voice on the radio is fast and flat. He uses the quick-fire request format without thinking. It is reflex now. First rounds arrive at 0720, 8 minutes and 14 seconds. The shells land directly across the road. The dismounting infantry is caught in the open. The lead tank stops. The column behind it compresses. 3 more fire missions in the next 40 minutes, all under 10 minutes response time, break the armored thrust on the northern approach. The Germans shift west. A second thrust at 1100 meets the same result. Fire mission called. 9 minutes, 50 seconds. A Tiger tank, one of only a handful committed in this sector, is immobilized by a near miss that blows a track. Its crew abandons it in the road, blocking the advance behind it. By nightfall, on December 17th, neither SS Panzer Division has taken either village. The 48-hour timetable is already broken. December 18th brings heavier armor and desperate German infantry assault. Grenadiers attack through the snowfields in waves. The fighting is hand-to-hand in some sectors, but the artillery is relentless. The quick-fire request means that every German concentration, every forming assault line, every vehicle column stopped on an icy road attracts counter-battery within minutes of being spotted. A German regimental after-action report written on December 19th, captured 3 weeks later, states, "Artillery response from American defenders is immediate and accurate to a degree that makes standard assault consolidation impossible. Units forming for second echelon attacks are engaged before movement is complete." This is not conventional artillery coordination. It is a different system. By the morning of December 19th, both SS Panzer divisions have been fought to a standstill. Their losses in the approach to Krinkelt-Rocherath amount to over 1,200 men killed or wounded, and more than 40 armored vehicles destroyed or disabled. They have advanced less than 3 miles from their start line. The northern shoulder holds. 50 miles south, the siege of Bastogne is entering its most critical phase. The 101st Airborne, surrounded and outnumbered, is holding on supply drops and stubbornness. But the units on the shoulders, the formations that prevent the bulge from becoming a collapse, are holding in part because of a communication protocol invented by a man who used to argue with auto workers about engine output ratios. The broader numbers come slowly, as they always do in war. But by February 1945, Gauss's office has compiled a preliminary analysis covering the period from September through December 1944. Units using the quick-fire request across all 4 months show an average reduction in hostile fire casualty rates of 28% compared to units without it. Fire mission effectiveness measured as confirmed enemy casualties or suppression per mission is up 41%. The German after-action reports from the Ardennes, reviewed by Allied intelligence analysts in January and February 1945, show a consistent pattern. American artillery response is cited as the primary tactical challenge in no fewer than 37 separate German unit reports. It is described as unexpected, disproportionate, and uncharacteristic of previous American performance. Several reports speculate about new technology. None identify the actual source. American unit morale surveys from the same period show a striking correlation. Units with the longest exposure to the quick-fire request system consistently report higher confidence in artillery support as a factor in combat effectiveness. Men fight differently when they know that if they call for fire, it arrives while the target still exists. Dawson is formally commended in February 1945, recommended by Gauss, and signed by 2 brigadier generals. The commendation language is careful and technical, describing the quick-fire request as a significant procedural improvement in fire coordination efficiency. It does not use the word genius. It does not use the word revolutionary. It does not need to. By March 1945, a version of the quick-fire request protocol has been incorporated into revised training materials for artillery coordination across the European theater of operations. It has been adapted, modified, and improved by the men who used it in the field, exactly as any good factory process gets refined by the workers on the line. The original document Dawson wrote in a Norman foxhole in July 1944 is unrecognizable in its current form, which is exactly how he would have wanted it. He never sought credit. He sought output. But here is the question that no commendation document addresses. Here is what the historians and the staff officers and the intelligence analysts all missed in their numbers and their reports and their after-action reviews. What happened to Bill Dawson after the war ended? What did a man who had changed the way an army fought do when he took off the uniform and went back to Michigan? And more importantly, what does his story tell us about every war that came after? About every system, military or otherwise, that still defaults to the way things have always been done? Because the people in charge were never factory foremen. In Part 4, we will follow Dawson home, and we will discover that the most important chapter of this story did not happen in a foxhole or a conference room or a Belgian village in the snow. It happened in a suburb of Detroit in 1947, when a man who had helped win a world war sat down across from a personnel manager who told him his factory experience gap was too large and the position had already been filled. The system that built the army had no place for the man who improved it. That story is more important than any battle, and almost nobody knows it. Over the course of 3 parts, we have followed a single thread from a muddy Norman foxhole to the frozen shoulders of the Ardennes. A Ford factory foreman named Bill Dawson looked at a process that was killing American soldiers and treated it the way he treated every jammed assembly line. He found the bottleneck, stripped out the waste, and made the line run faster. His quick-fire request compressed artillery response from 30 minutes to under 9. It survived a hostile bureaucracy, passed a formal test spread across the Western Front, and played a measurable role in holding the northern shoulder of the Battle of the Bulge, when 2 SS Panzer divisions needed to break through and could not. The cliffhanger we left you with was this: what happened to the man when the war ended? What does a system built by factory foremen do with the factory foreman once the system no longer needs them? The answer is more complicated and more human than any battle. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Bill Dawson was in a replacement depot outside Frankfurt when the news came through. He was 35 years old. He had been in uniform for 2 years and 4 months. He had been formally commended once, recommended for promotion twice without result, and had watched a protocol he designed in a foxhole become standard training material for an entire theater of operations without his name attached to it anywhere in the final documentation. He took the train home to Michigan in September 1945. His wife Helen met him at the station in Dearborn with their daughter, who was 7 years old and did not entirely remember him. The photograph from that day, which his daughter kept on her mantelpiece until she died in 2019, shows a man who looks older than 35, not damaged, just used, the way a good tool looks after serious work. He applied to Ford in October 1945. Not for his old position, which had been filled, but for a supervisory role in the expanded post-war production line. The personnel manager who interviewed him was polite and thorough. He reviewed Dawson's pre-war record, which was excellent. He noted the 2-year gap in factory employment. He asked what Dawson had been doing in the Army. Fire coordination, Dawson said. Process optimization. The personnel manager wrote something in his file. The position, he explained, had already been filled by a man who had been with the company throughout the war in a reserved occupation. Dawson's experience gap was a concern. They would keep his application on file. Dawson drove home and told Helen that Ford had passed. She made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, and he explained in the flat Midwestern voice that never rose above a certain frequency that he had spent 2 years redesigning how an army fights, and come home to find that his factory job had been given to a man who stayed behind. He was not bitter about it. That was the thing his daughter remembered most clearly 70 years later when she spoke about her father. He was not a bitter man. He was a problem solver, and a man without a job is simply a man with a problem that has not been solved yet. He found work at a smaller manufacturer in Detroit in early 1946, running a production line making automobile components. He was good at it. He was better than good. Within 18 months, he had been promoted to plant operations manager, and within 3 years, the facility's output per worker hour had increased by 31%, using methods that looked to anyone paying attention very much like the logic embedded in the quick-fire request. Identify the unnecessary steps. Collapse the verification timeline. Trust the people on the line to execute if you give them a format that is simple enough to run under pressure. He never spoke publicly about the war. His daughter found out what he had done only in 1987, when a military historian writing about artillery development in the European theater contacted the family after finding Dawson's name in Goss's archived correspondence. She called her father, who was 77 years old and living in a retirement community outside Ann Arbor, and asked him why he had never told her. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It was just fixing a bottleneck, sweetheart. I didn't think it was the kind of thing you put in a Christmas card." He died in 1993 at the age of 83. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his 30-year career in manufacturing management. It did not mention the war. It did not mention the quick-fire request. But his legacy was already operating in 47 countries, and almost none of them knew where it had started. The protocol Dawson designed in July 1944 did not survive the post-war period in its original form. Nothing does. But the principle it embodied, which is the systematic compression of decision-to-action timelines through pre-formatted communication structures, became one of the foundational concepts of modern military fire coordination. The United States Army's field artillery doctrine underwent a comprehensive revision in 1948 and again in 1956. Both revisions incorporated elements of what Dawson had demonstrated, translated into formal language, and attributed to the general lessons of the European theater rather than to any individual. The principle of embedding verification data within the transmission itself, rather than requiring separate confirmation back channels, became standard. Response time benchmarks that would have seemed impossible to the colonels who watched the first test in August 1944 became routine training targets. During the Korean War, American artillery units operating with updated coordination protocols were achieving fire for effect in an average of 11 minutes in the first months of the conflict, declining to 8 minutes by mid-1951 as training and communication equipment improved. North Korean and Chinese after-action reports from that period contain language that is strikingly similar to the German reports from Normandy in 1944. Artillery response is too fast. The tactical window for displacement is too narrow. Cause is unclear. Vietnam brought further compression. Digital fire control systems, introduced in the late 1960s, reduced coordination timelines to under 5 minutes in some configurations. By the Gulf War in 1991, certain fire support coordination systems were achieving response times measured in seconds rather than minutes, with digital targeting data bypassing voice communication entirely for pre-designated target categories. The lineage from Dawson's handwritten protocol to a GPS-guided artillery shell requested through a digital fire control terminal is not straight, and it is not documented in any single paper. But the logic is continuous. Every generation of military engineers who worked on fire coordination looked at the existing process and asked the same question Dawson asked in a Norman hedgerow in 1944. Where is the unnecessary step, and what does it cost to keep it? The answer in every generation was the same. It costs lives. Historians estimate that improved fire coordination protocols across American military operations from 1944 through the end of the Cold War contributed to a reduction in friendly casualties from delayed or inaccurate fire support, that in aggregate numbers in the tens of thousands. The estimate is imprecise because you cannot count the men who did not die. You can only count the response times and the casualty rates and draw the line between them. But the line is there, and it is clear. 19 nations currently use artillery coordination protocols that incorporate structural elements first demonstrated in the Western Front reforms of late 1944. None of the training manuals cite a Ford factory foreman from Michigan. The deepest lesson of this story is not about artillery. It is not even about war. It is about what institutions do with the ideas of people who were not supposed to have them. The German military of 1944 was by any technical measure an extraordinary institution. Its doctrine was sophisticated. Its officers were educated and experienced. Its tactical flexibility, the Auftrags tactic that allowed a sergeant to make decisions that required a colonel in any other army, was genuinely innovative for its time. And yet, it could not absorb the kind of improvement that Dawson made to American fire coordination because its system of innovation flowed downward from educated professionals to trained specialists. Ideas moved from the top down. The American military was by the same technical measure a less polished institution in 1944. Its officers varied enormously in quality. Its enlisted men were, as the German assessments correctly noted, civilians in uniform with limited tactical experience. But it had built, perhaps accidentally, perhaps as a reflection of a society that genuinely believed a grocery store stockboy could become a senator, a system where ideas could move upward, where a sergeant's unsanctioned protocol modification could reach a general's desk in 6 weeks and be formally tested rather than court-martialed. That asymmetry, not the tanks or the artillery or the industrial production, was the deepest source of American military power in the Second World War. The Wehrmacht was an army of brilliant performers executing a genius system. The American Army was a system designed to find the genius in ordinary performers. History is full of men like Dawson. Sergeant Alvin York was a Tennessee farmer who taught the Army something about marksmanship. Petty Officer John Finn was an aviation ordnance man who taught it something about courage under fire. Chester Nimitz grew up washing dishes in his grandfather's hotel. Dwight Eisenhower was the son of a creamery worker. The American military of the Second World War did not produce greatness from its institutions. It recognized greatness when ordinary men produced it, and then it scaled it. That is the thing that terrified the German High Command when they finally understood it. Not the tanks, not the artillery, not the endless supply of chocolate and cigarettes and portable showers. It was the realization that their enemy had built a machine that could find Bill Dawson in a foxhole, take his idea, and reproduce it across an entire theater of operations in under 6 months, because the system had been designed from the beginning to assume that the best idea in any given crisis might be sitting in the lowest rank in the room. Now here is the detail that almost nobody knows. The one that was buried in archived correspondence for 40 years before a historian pulled it out by accident. In November 1944, while the formal adoption of the quick-fire request was working its way through Army bureaucracy, Major General Goss received an inquiry from an unexpected source. The British 21st Army Group, operating to the north of the American forces, had noticed the improvement in American artillery response times through routine liaison channels and wanted to understand the source. Goss sent them a copy of Dawson's original protocol document, the handwritten one from the Norman foxhole, along with his formal technical analysis. The British liaison officer who received it wrote back within 2 weeks. His letter, which sits in the National Archives in a file labeled Miscellaneous Fire Support Correspondence, ETO 1944, contains one sentence that has never been quoted in any history of the campaign. He wrote, "The enclosed document is either the work of a very experienced artillery officer who has concealed his training brilliantly, or the work of a man who has never been trained at all, and therefore could not see why the existing process was necessary. In either case, it works." He was right on both counts, and Dawson would have appreciated the precision of the observation, because it was exactly the kind of clear-eyed assessment he applied to every jammed assembly line he ever fixed. The existing process existed. Experienced men had built it. They had good reasons. And none of those reasons mattered as much as the fact that men were dying in the gap between the radio call and the falling shell. From a grocery store factory floor in Michigan, to a foxhole in Normandy, to the frozen shoulders of the Ardennes, Bill Dawson proved something that institutions resist admitting, and history keeps confirming. The most dangerous person in any system is the one who looks at the way things have always been done and asks simply and without sentiment whether the cost of keeping it is worth paying. He was not a hero in the way the word is usually used. He did not charge a machine gun or throw himself on a grenade. He sat in a muddy field and did arithmetic. He counted the minutes and the dead and decided the ratio was wrong, and then he fixed it with a piece of paper and the same calm stubbornness he had used for 7 years on the Ford assembly line. In the end, the German military mind, the inheritor of Clausewitz and Moltke, the product of a century of professional military education, was not defeated by a better general or a superior doctrine. It was defeated by the accumulated weight of 10,000 ordinary men who looked at impossible problems and brought to them the same patient, relentless practical intelligence they had used to build cars and farmland and stock shelves. The army that won the Second World War was not the army of brilliant commanders, though it had those. It was the army of factory foremen, And the factory foreman never forgot what the generals sometimes did, that the only number that matters at the end of any day is how many men came home.